Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. With me today on Writers at Work is Addie E. Citchens, author of the new novel Dominion, published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux. A family drama set in Dominion, Mississippi, it unfolds through the eyes of two women, Priscilla, wife of an abusive and well-to-do preacher and mother to 5 talented sons, and Diamond, girlfriend to Wonder Boy, the youngest of those 5 young men. Though warm and witty, the story is infused with a sense of dread on every page. It is Addie E. Citchens' debut novel. Addie's work has appeared in the New Yorker, the Paris Review, and Oxford America's Best of the South, among other publications. Her writing about the blues and its history appeared in Mississippi Folk Life and on the Mississippi Arts Hour. Earlier this year, her short story, That Girl, won the O. Henry Prize. It was originally published in the New Yorker and can be found on that magazine's website. Calling it absolutely outstanding, of Dominion, Roxane Gay said, "It captures church community, the South, and the gulf between the haves and have-nots with precision." As a stranger to Priscilla and Diamond's world, I found Dominion both captivating and an education, and a wonderful read. Addie E. Citchens, welcome to Writers at Work.
Thank you for having me, Jim.
Yeah. Addie, I note that you attended the Florida State University Creative Writing Program and the Callaloo Creative Writing Workshop. How did those programs help you develop as a writer?
I think more so they helped me develop as a person. Just because Florida State wasn't what I expected. So I think definitely gained adaptability from that program. Um because it wasn't a whole lot of writing, it was a lot of lit. And so I think maybe it taught me how to shift and keep it going regardless to what I expected and whether those expectations were met. Um, Callaloo just taught me the value of networking and friends and people who believed in your work.
I love that word adaptability that you use. And I asked that question because in reading Dominion and rereading That Girl, I had a sense that you were really writing freely, that you were giving the stories the air they needed to develop, yet you were bringing us into intimate contact with the characters in a distinctive setting. A two-part question. A, do you accept that assessment?
I absolutely do. I think that's a glorious assessment, and that's what I wanted. So thank you for seeing that.
The other thing I'd say is I'm not sure that that is a skill that can be taught, Addie. I don't know that you can actually teach a writer to let it rip.
I don't think so either because my experience with creative writing programs has been so buttoned up and so technical. And so I think you're often taught the opposite. But I think there's an innate freeness in you that you have to be able to let it rip. And I've always kind of always been a person that always let it all hang out.
Yeah. You,
So
you know, no,
I
no.
think I just reflect that in my words.
Yeah, what I was going to say is, we know people who write freely but are really self-conscious people or don't have a kind of boldness in their day-to-day conduct. Um, it's a strange phenomenon how that a writer can just let go in other ways that she or he may not be able to.
Right.
Just an idle thought there.
Oh
Um,
no, you're absolutely right.
yeah. We all have fits and starts on our path to becoming a novelist. Looking back, how do you assess your path? I mean, there you are, a young student in Clarksdale, Mississippi, and then you're published in the New Yorker, but a lot of stuff happened in between, you know. How was your path to being published?
Circuitous. It was a long and winding road. So um it began, I always knew I was a reader at very young. My mom was a teacher when I was young. So we had books and she was very good friends with the librarian, and the librarian would always give us the books that her daughter had outgrown. So we were reading books way beyond, my sister and I were reading books way beyond our reading level as young kids, just because we had them everywhere. And it was kind of like an escape for us. And so I always knew I wanted to write, but being a good reader meant I was a good test taker. And so that meant my whole life people were telling me I was going to be a doctor or a lawyer because I could ace the standardized test. So when I graduated high school from Clarksdale High, I started off in biology. And I can remember specifically a guy in my biology class telling me, Addie Kitchens is not a doctor's name, it's a writer's name. And I took that and kind of ran with it. But it took a couple of more years. I fell in love when I think my sophomore year in college, I like had my first love, and the time for science was over. The time for words and poems,
Mhm.
that was the time for that. And so I switched over, and after that, I taught a couple of years. I worked at a bank. I did extra work on TV, and all the time I was writing. And I think I wrote the original draft to this particular novel, Dominion, probably as early as 2012, 2013, but
My goodness.
I couldn't get it sold because agents loved the first half but hated the second half. And I didn't know how to fix it. So I kept living my bohemian life. I wrote the novel that that girl comes from a long time ago too. And so I wrote those like right together, maybe in like a 2 year span, and they had just been sitting. So I was just doing life. I was doing life, doing people, doing jobs, and doing everything but getting tied in a job so I wouldn't have to use my energy to work a 9 to 5.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had a part-time job. I worked 8 hours a week at one job. So it was just trying to get enough money to support myself and write.
Yeah. And when you were writing, there's something in us, I think, that tells us that this is what we're supposed to be doing. And I think maybe it's not always it can't always be articulated, but it's just something that feels right. Was that your experience?
Absolutely, because it definitely wasn't articulated through, responses to my work. Because I only sent out very rarely, but when I sent it out, it wasn't, writers and rejections. It's just part for the course. So there's something in me that just wouldn't let me get attached to anything else. It's like I couldn't. I mean, it's like nothing, there was nothing else I wanted to do. And I made a ritual around writing. So the entire time I was doing other things, I was paying my writing first. I was writing in the morning before I went to work. I was writing in the afternoon after I came back. I paid it first. And so I always knew that was what I wanted to do and what I would do. I just had, it took time to figure it out.
Yeah, yeah. I used to, whenever I had a setback, I used to say, "Doesn't matter, I'm a writer."
That.
I always had, it was always that ace in the hole for me. And of course, finally we get to play that ace at some point.
Exactly, right?
Eddie, I wanted to say that, and I said this in the introduction. I know nothing about the world that you're writing about, and when I say nothing, I mean zero. Um, but one of the ways that you captured me and held on to me is your keen eye for setting. Um, can you recall at what age you began to realize that you were in a place worth writing about?
I always say like, I had a friend of mine who wrote this article called "I Hate the Blues," and it was the same thing with me. Um, I think in my revulsion toward where I was from, I knew in that there was something there. So I think I knew, but I didn't know. But then I was running from it. I was running from this idea of writing because I wanted to write about everything else but where I was from. For me,
Yes.
there was something kind of shameful about it. That little dusty corner of the country. But then I just realized, it was in my grandmother's voice. It was in her hands. It was how she could make a statement. Like if I asked my grandmother how she was, she'd be like, I'm like a bear making tricks and ain't going nowhere. And I'm like, what does that mean? So I was picking it up in that. I was picking it up in the fact that I could sit on my mailbox and from across a field I could hear the blues club playing all night. I was picking it up from just the way people spoke, the way people moved, people's bodies, and it was something different about there that I recognized when I was away from there that I knew that I wanted to encapsulate in the story, but it did take time. It
Yeah.
probably took until I was in my 20s to understand that, I was going to write about it. But it's kind of like I knew but avoided it, but it wasn't until my 20s that I really realized, this was the source of my particular kind of genius. So I couldn't ignore it anymore.
Yeah. And once you open up that vein, you understand how rich it is.
Yeah, absolutely. The richness and just like it's the birthplace of America's music. I'm from Clarksville, Mississippi.
Sure.
It's the birthplace of America's industry. You see the black fields, it's the ritual in growing things. It's every year at time, they're gonna plant this at this time. And it's gonna come up at this time. And by the height of the corn, what time of year it is. So that beautiful ritual and everything, I think, made me know it was something just so beautiful in it
Yeah.
that deserved to be written about in a way that wasn't caricature.
Right. Right. Setting though, it can be a trap. If you choose, I think choosing the right setting is the most important decision a novelist makes. But if it's a place we know well, we can run the risk of over sentimentalizing it, or
Right.
or if we have unpleasant memories, misrepresenting it. So ultimately, how did you balance your feelings when you were creating the fictional Dominion? What did you keep? What did you throw out?
I kept the music and I threw out a little bit of the ugly, but it's not to say it won't come back in something else. Um I think it was so important, so for me, for the characters to take up a lot of exploring what the setting meant. I want to express that setting through them and not necessarily just by itself, so we can understand more of how it affects the people from there and not the setting in itself. You know, I
Yes,
didn't want,
yes.
yeah. If I'm making sense, I
No, no,
didn't
you're
want,
you're making perfect sense because I find when I read if the setting is well established and the characters seem to grow out of it,
yeah,
it's a much richer experience than if you have your characters and you slap them into a setting.
right. So that's how I tried to avoid over sentiment, the sentimental. I'm
Yeah,
from the
gotcha. No, I
yeah,
gotcha. I gotcha for sure.
and that's how I tried to avoid it, making the people not just a function or a result of the setting, but their ways blooming out of that setting, but very much being a product of it.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think um, the idea that the story is told through the eyes of the two women really anchor us in place because they are in place.
Right.
Right. So, and what came first, that girl or early drafts of Dominion?
I actually, you know, I actually have no idea which one of these stories because it was like a decade ago. But I
Right.
also know that they were written back to back. So if I wrote one in 1 year, I think I wrote one novel in 6 months and then started on the other.
Okay.
And so they're back to back because I kind of meant them to be companion pieces.
Yeah.
So they were almost simultaneous. They're like Irish twins. Let's say that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I didn't know that that girl was a novel.
Yeah, I pulled it from a novel. I when I got the FSG Writers Fellowship, I sold them two novels at the same time. And that one had been finished, for a while as well.
I see, because it works so completely as a short story.
It's like the Black Girl's Buildings Grown Man from it follows that character from the time she's like slightly before that time um that girl starts slightly before that time till she's about 35, almost 40 years old.
Yeah. Yeah, I do remember that story the first time I read it. Um, and I think it was the vividness of, again, the setting and how they blossomed from the setting. I think that's what stuck with me. I guess that must be your thing, Addie.
It's a path I had to take myself. So I think maybe I think as a writer, and I may not be speaking for every writer, but I know I'm speaking for a lot of our writers. A lot of writers, I think we're trying to scream out ourselves in some way.
Yes,
And I think the ability, because a lot of people get stuck where I'm from. They get stuck and it feels like a trap to them, but I had to write my way out of it in my mind, and I had to write my way into loving it again. And so I want to show that in all the stories I write about it, my city, my place, my home, you know.
yes. I would say, and I think I may have alluded to this earlier. Um, there are scenes um, in the short story That Girl and in Dominion that work because you leave much unsaid, and yet we have a sense, more so than the characters do, of where things could go. Is that a fair assessment?
That is, I've realized as I've grown up and gotten therapy and all that kind of stuff, is that the way that we were taught to deal with things and not necessarily overtly taught to do it, but we just followed this pattern of silence if it was difficult and violence if you pressed the idea. And
Right.
so, which might mean a terrible argument. So, silence and violence were the ways I learned to deal with things. And so, yeah, and the book just reflected my own teaching, the way that I saw people deal with things. Either, I didn't see discourse. I didn't see people sitting down and like, let's talk about this difficult thing and let's come to an agreement. Let's come to some safe space. No, I didn't see that. So it was probably part of my own shortcomings as a human that made me write it that way.
I'm always reluctant to talk about particular scenes in a book because I don't want ever to give anything away, because I do believe the joy of reading is in the surprise at times. But there is a scene where Diamond, the young girl, is going to get into the car with the Reverend. And I remember distinctly saying out loud, "Don't get in that car." That's my that's an example of where you as the author let we the reader fill in the blanks. That you left something unsaid as a writer because you trusted the reader.
Absolutely. And I've gotten so many questions about the story after the fact that I just won't answer just because I do trust the reader. And when you're in school and you do all that theory stuff, reader response theory was the only one that made sense to me because it is what it is.
Yeah.
So I always fell back on trusting the reader, not ever explaining things. Um, and that's because that's the kind of reader I am myself. If there are certain things I don't understand about the text or some cultural difference, I don't need to understand every aspect of it to enjoy the story or to be perplexed by the story or to be, complicated by the story in ways that good books do to you. I don't need to understand it. I just need to follow it for the moment. And if I really want more information about it, I'll go look it up. So I'm just big on not telling everything and you make your own. And it's also in that notion of like small town people being people in everybody's business, is that there are some things that you'll never know. And it's just it might feel raw, but it just is as it is.
Yeah. What did Thelonious Monk say? What did he say? What you don't play can be more important than what you do play.
Yeah.
And I think for writers, that's the case, particularly if you given your readers enough information that they can have their own conclusions.
Right. And we're in this world where we're the microwave world where everything is visual. And there are less readers because everything, you can see everything and they can put everything in one scene for you. And people who seek to read are people who seek to be troubled in those ways. And, that's who we write to, I think, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah. I was looking at some of the reviews and I noticed that many of them emphasize the sexual repression faced by Priscilla, the wife of the preacher, and Diamond, the young girlfriend of Wonder Boy. Um, and indeed, you show us that Priscilla was essentially raped on a regular basis by her husband in the early days of the marriage. And, whether Diamond will be gratified sexually isn't part of the equation at all. Um, is that a proper interpretation?
Absolutely. I don't like it took once again, it took I was at Florida State and I had written an early version of a part that will go in the novel that girl is in. And they were telling me, well, when the rape happened, I'm like, what rape? So this was just the way we thought I was taught to think of sex. A lot of what I knew as sex was actual sexual violence, which took me getting educated, me seeking knowledge to understand, no, this is not sex. This is something else. It's not. So for what was happening with Priscilla in those early days of her marriage, that would have just been considered honoring your husband, submitting to your husband. So these are thought patterns that I had to work my way out of, uh, and I had to seek help to do it. And also, I don't know, like, I wonder if I have like, my grandmother had 7 daughters. And I'm like, I wonder if they were having pleasure, if they were having orgasms, if they were having, but that was just not something, pleasure wasn't something you should seek. That made you not a good woman if you wanted pleasure. If you wanted
Yeah,
your partner to please you sexually, that made you a whore. That made you not a Jezebel. That made you not a good person. And so pleasure, that was, what's that? What's
right.
that?
And one of the things you do with Priscilla that I found fascinating is that um, she's aware of her situation. She comes to a slow awareness of her situation and simultaneously denies it and is terrified by it. Um, she's so entwined in the cultural mores that there's part of her that senses that this is wrong, and there's part of her that says, "But nonetheless, I'm here." Yeah, am I reading her correctly?
Absolutely. That's
Okay.
part of being dutiful. That's part of being dutiful is carrying a high level of delusion. And Priscilla did that well, even while sitting there with the truth in her face. So another way you honor your husband where I'm from is you keep his secrets. You keep your family secret, and that means keeping your family secrets. That means bearing it like a backpack.
Yeah. Uh, both women know themselves fairly well, though. I mean, which is part of Priscilla's tragedy. I mean, she raises these five boys, and she serves the community, yet she's imprisoned. Um, did she come to you fully formed, or did you have to sort of develop her to? I mean, when did you start seeing Priscilla as Priscilla is in the final version of the book?
I've seen Priscilla as I'm a church kid. I was a church kid. I was a church kid. And so I've been seeing Priscilla in every woman that walked down the church aisle in her heels and her giant church hat. This was the preacher's wife. This was the deacon's wife. This was my mother. This was, all these are the women. Priscilla was one of the type of women that raised me. And so I think at the end of my acknowledgments, I say I had like 1,000 mothers. And she is one of the thousand mothers I had that I watched. Observed them, and from them I learned what to do and what not to do. And so she pretty much came to me as she was from the time I was a little girl.
I see.
I knew this woman intimately.
Yeah. Regarding Diamond, there's a very telling and wonderfully paced paragraph in which she tells us how well she understands the reality of her situation. I'm going to quote what you've written. She says, I didn't even know what I was interested in. I wasn't one of those kids who had the luxury of knowing what was next. All the time I was growing up, when I imagined the future I was supposed to care so much about, I saw blackness, not like death, but nothingness. Addie, that's really heartbreaking.
Yeah. I mean, it was her reality. And it's that understanding that there's a stability, and what stability creates for kids is imagination. And that part of imagining is imagining that you could be sitting in an office running a Fortune 500 company in the future. And that's a liberty that kids like Diamond wouldn't have, you know.
Yeah,
And there's a phrase where I'm from, and they just say, I can't call it. And she had a life she couldn't call at that time. And it wasn't until the end of the novel that she discovered that she could influence her own future. She could call it because she could start changing things for herself. And I think
yeah,
that's the most priceless journey in this novel for me. Her going from seeing black to seeing what she could create for herself.
yeah. Again, I don't want to delve too deeply into it for fear of giving too much away, but um, let me put it this way. Priscilla and Diamond develop what might be called a pragmatic relationship. And you tell the story from rotating points of view. Priscilla has a section, then Diamond, then back to Priscilla, and so on. Um, so how did you decide to use that technique to tell the story?
So I read this story in a long time ago because I've read stories from different points of view. Um, that were like used in big, like I remember Judy Blume's Summer Sisters. I read that book, and it had mainly one character, Victoria's point of view, but then it split up in other points of view. And so that kind of intrigued me. But then I read this novel, and I think it's called excuse me. I think it was called something about the life of Apple Johnny, but he was a man. And the story was told from alternating points of view between women that loved him. And that kind of like stayed in my mind. I think I read that story as like in my early 20s. And so that the way they did that stayed in my mind. And I was like, I want to experiment with that one day. But it wasn't until I started thinking about formulating this story that I realized that it would be a perfect setup for this story because I wanted to use these two generations of women And I wanted to hear both of their voices because these are the voices that would be most silenced where I'm from.
Yeah. And they're talking past each other a lot of times. I
Right.
mean, we see a scene from um, one point of view and then from the other point of view, and they don't agree really on what they just witnessed or participated in. But neither of them is wrong, but neither of them is completely right. And
Unreliable narrators, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think one thing that pulls us through is how are these women gonna come to some mutual understanding about anything? Never mind the young man that they share.
Absolutely. But they come to that, and when this novel set so many years, I had to have a certain set of life experiences before I was able to do what it took to finish it in a way that satisfied me.
Yeah,
So part of that was decentering patriarchal ideas in my life and those ideas that harmed me and made absolutely no sense at all. And so I think in this novel, these characters are maybe not completely doing it, but they're realizing, some of the status quo shouldn't be the status quo. And so they're beginning to understand the hypocrisies and they're beginning to understand themselves outside of those hypocrisies that the patriarchy, says it should be. So
right.
I think, the story had to come from me decentering these ideas that I was taught about, men being almost always right, no matter what. And so the characters did the same thing, but maybe not so successfully. But it was a try,
Yeah, but there that sense of entitlement that precedes or leads to that the sexual assault or the sexual manipulation we talked about earlier. Um, and you convey that very well. That the preacher, Reverend Saber Winfrey Jr., is the most influential man in town, and you give him a very clever sense of control. He owns media and he owns the social center. He owns the radio station and the barber shop.
right?
Um, so he is deeply entrenched as the power in the community. How did you develop his character?
I really had fun developing his character because, one of those things I say, if I was a man, would I be a good man? And I'm like, sometimes I think, okay, absolutely not. And so I kind of like wanted to put everything in him because it was kind of myself as the biggest, meanest man I could be if I were a man. Um, and so it was fun in that way. But he also had many inspirations in my hometown. And so it's just that compilation of the men I knew, plus this idea in our community that if you made money, you were a good man, period. You could do whatever. You make money, you make people happy, you give them a sense of what you could do whatever you want. And so I think his entitlement came from he's like um been appointed king of the town. And so he has this idea that he's, like a king. And entitlement comes with kings, right?
Yeah, yeah. There's something that I loved in the book, even before even before the prologue. You have the history of the Seven Seals Church, and he's the pastor of it, um, and it's quite thorough, this history. Um, did you have this before you wrote the novel, or I mean, was it a guide for you to keep you on track, or did you write it after the fact?
Like I said, I wrote this novel many years back. So all of that part, the first part came out almost exactly like it still is now.
I
And
see.
so my mom was the church secretary when I was young. And so she's still the church secretary, actually. So what she would do is for the church anniversary every year, she would compile the church history and add on to it every year. And I was fascinated by her doing this. And what she would do is she would Xerox all these things 100 times, and my sister and I would, put staples in it and make it a program, and we would, the ushers would pass it out. And so I was enamored with this process for some reason, and it was something that stuck beyond none of the biblical teachings stuck, but her what she did, for the church, those things stuck. And so, yeah, that came from my childhood. There was a history that she would add on to every
Yeah.
year that had been in process. Also, I wanted to put that history in there just to show how quickly a man's actions can destroy all of what somebody else had built.
Yeah. I was thinking that for a writer, um, if you did this in advance, it wouldn't be good. It would be like outlining too detailed. It would restrict your freedom. But if you were sort of compiling it along the way, it would be very helpful to keep you focused. I don't know. I don't know. Another thing you do that I really loved is you have the preacher's notes for his sermons every few chapters, and we get a chance to see how his behavior conflicts with his preaching, which I really did love that. Anyway, I'm giving too much away, so let's no, let's talk about the blues.
Okay, let's talk about the blues.
Yeah, yeah. So when you were a child, did people openly appreciate like Charlie Patton or Son House or John Lee
Yeah,
Hooker?
yeah, people did. But I don't think they imparted that on us. And that's like a tradition you should pass on, just like, a mashed potato recipe. Do people have a recipe that, like, for Thanksgiving? Those are some of those things. And so blues is one of those things that I kind of just ignored. And I think about like all the things my grandma, all the recipes my grandmother had. My grandmother could forage. She could chop wood. She was chopping wood at 78. And all of those
Wow.
things that she knew that we didn't find value in at the time. We could be on the crux of the collapse of society. I should know the herbs. I
Yeah, yeah.
gotta go
No,
eat them.
right.
So I think blues was one of those things that I didn't that was always around, but I didn't necessarily find the value in until I had gotten to be a grown woman.
I see. So if you were in Clarksdale and you said I wanted to be a writer, did people say, well, be like Tennessee Williams and Richard Ford, or did they say you should really study Charlie Patton?
No, when I said I wanted to be a writer, people in Clarksville said, "Oh, journalism, you want to write for newspapers."
Mm.
Nobody even thought about, like, I had no idea that people no I knew no one who wrote fiction or who wrote novels and stuff. So everybody's assuming I wanted to be a TV anchor or a journalist or something like
I
that.
see. I see. I
So,
see. The reason I ask is I grew up in Frank Sinatra's hometown. And it was very weird because people were simultaneously proud of him, and yet almost every man I met who was his age would say terrible things about him because they were jealous of him.
hmm,
And one time I interviewed a musician from Okima, uh, Oklahoma, which is where Woody Guthrie was born. And I asked him if he learned about Woody Guthrie in school. And he said no, the town acted like they were ashamed of him. So
wow.
I was kind of curious about,
No, but we didn't. The blues weren't something we learned about in school. And actually, because it came out of that cotton field sharecropping thing, we were taught to be ashamed of it.
yeah,
Definitely.
but there's you could take a Charlie Patton song or a Son House song and turn it into a short story very easily. All the elements are there. The
Precisely.
perception of human behaviors is I find it a fascinating thing that we seem
And
to be a
people see blues as something just sad and But no, the blues is actually resistance. And so you can be looking so closely, you miss everything that a person says. And I think that happened in my novel too, with some of the reviews. This guy at this big magazine that I won't mention, but like you looking so closely, you miss the point. And I think that happens when you're looking at like John, you miss John Hooker, you miss the nuance for reading line for line, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's next for you, Addie?
I'm always writing. So I'll be editing the novel that girl came from next. I just finished a short story. Um doing the research because there's this area in the capital Mississippi called Dudaville, and it was bought up by this Italian priest, and it was a black neighborhood, and so the neighborhood was so rough that if someone got ill or got sick, the ambulance wouldn't come through there. You had to bring them to Gallina Street on a
Wow.
stretcher, and that's the only way the ambulance would pick them up. And so I've been doing uh getting research about it, and I want to make this epic historical fiction story about it, but that's in the wings, waiting on all the other stuff that's trying to get out of my brain.
My guest on this episode of Writers at Work has been Addie E. Citchens, author of the new novel Dominion and the recipient of the O. Henry Prize. Addie, thanks so much for joining us on Writers at Work.
Thank you so much for having me, Jim. This was wonderful. Great questions, great company. Thank you.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusili. Until next time, happy reading.